The lake looked like glass in the early morning light, still and silver beneath a soft sky. A single loon called out somewhere in the mist, low and haunting, and from the wraparound porch of the cedar-paneled summer house, Daniel Whitaker watched steam curl up from his coffee. He stood barefoot, shirtless, the cuff of his gray sweatpants brushing the tops of his feet as he leaned against the porch railing. Inside the house there was silence, for now. He was waiting for the chaos to begin. It always started with the thump of little feet above his head, followed by the slow crescendo of his daughter Ellie as she came to terms with waking up. She was 7 and hated mornings, much like her mother had, except her mother hadn't been in their lives for over 3 years now. What was left of her memory was fragmented, a smile in a photograph, a lullaby Ellie didn't quite remember but insisted on every night. Daniel took another sip of coffee and glanced out at the water again. This house on Lake Alder was supposed to be a break from everything. A summer away from boardrooms and stockholder meetings and 12-hour days. His assistant, Kara, had all but threatened him to take the sabbatical. "Your daughter barely knows what your weekends look like," she'd said, typing furiously on her tablet. "You're going, period. I'll handle the quarterly call-ins." So he came, with every intention to unwind, maybe even fish, be a dad again, maybe for the first time in a long time. But within 2 days of arriving, it had become painfully obvious that he couldn't cook, not well. Ellie had gently but clearly refused to eat another one of his dry, too crispy grilled cheeses. She'd pushed her plate across the table and said, "Daddy, it's okay if you don't know how. We can ask someone to help us." He'd winced, not just because she was right, but because she'd said it without frustration or sass. Just quiet observation. He had made a call that night after she'd gone to bed. His property manager had given him a local number, said there was a woman who did summer house help for some of the vacationers, cooking mostly. She might be available. He hadn't expected her to answer the phone herself. Her voice had been calm, a little husky, like she'd just woken from a nap or maybe spent the afternoon reading by the lake. "I cook," she said after he explained what he needed, "but I don't do maid service or childcare." "I'm not looking for that," he'd replied, the words coming sharper than he meant. "I can handle everything else, just meals, something real. I'm here with my daughter, she's 7. There had been a pause, then the rustle of pages or maybe paper towels, and she'd said, "All right, I'll come by in the morning and meet you both." And now he was waiting. When the old green pickup pulled into the long gravel drive, it stirred dust into the early light. Daniel leaned forward slightly. The woman who stepped out wasn't what he expected. She wore worn jeans and a loose oatmeal-colored sweater with the sleeves pushed to her elbows. Her dark hair was pinned up in a way that looked both effortless and entirely feminine, and she carried a canvas bag in one hand, keys in the other. She didn't look like someone who would cater. She looked like someone who belonged in this place, like she'd grown from the lake and pine trees and summer wind. She saw him as she rounded the porch and lifted a hand in a half-wave. "You must be Daniel," she said, walking up the steps. Her voice matched the one on the phone, low, warm, casual. "I am your Grace," she replied. "Grace Weller, mind if I come in?" He held the door for her and stepped aside. "Come on in, Ellie's just waking up." The kitchen still smelled faintly of the attempt he'd made at scrambled eggs, which had ended in a pan soaking in the sink and a bowl of cereal instead. Grace dropped her bag on the counter and took a slow glance around the space. Her eyes were steady, unreadable, and he felt oddly like he was being assessed. "This place is nice," she said, opening the fridge. "You brought groceries, at least that's something." "Basic stuff. I didn't know what we'd need." She nodded, reaching in and pulling out eggs and butter. "All right, how many days a week are you thinking?" "All of them." That gave her pause. She turned, leaned her hip against the counter and studied him again. "That's a lot of cooking." "It's a long summer," he replied, "and I want real meals for my daughter, not frozen pizza." The sound of small feet finally came, followed by a sleepy voice. "Daddy." Daniel turned just in time to see Ellie rounding the stairs in an oversized t-shirt and socks, her curls wild and her cheeks puffy with sleep. Her eyes found Grace immediately. "Hi," she said, a little shy but curious. Grace smiled, soft and genuine. "Hi, sweetheart, I'm Grace. I'm going to help your dad make better breakfasts." Ellie lit up like sunrise. "Yay." Daniel didn't remember the last time something so simple had made her smile like that. Grace cracked the eggs with one hand and pulled a skillet from the rack above the stove like she'd always been there. By the time breakfast was ready, the kitchen felt different, like something had shifted slightly off its axis. There was music playing, soft folk from her phone, and Ellie was humming between bites of toast. Daniel sat across from them both, watching. He couldn't have said why, but his shoulders felt lighter. He hadn't even noticed how tight they'd been. After breakfast, Grace rinsed the pans and wiped the counters. She didn't ask about cleaning, didn't offer to do more than she was there to do. When he asked if she could come every day around the same time, she said yes without hesitation. As she gathered her bag and keys to leave, Ellie followed her to the door. "Will you make lunch too?" Grace glanced at Daniel. "If it's all right with your dad." He nodded. "Lunch, dinner too, if you're available." "I'll need a key then," she said easily. "I won't come too early, just before breakfast." He handed her one from the small hook by the door. "Thank you." She didn't say "you're welcome." She just smiled again, quiet, composed, and stepped back onto the porch. When she was gone, Ellie turned to him with a grin. "She smells like cinnamon," she said, like it was the highest compliment. Daniel chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "She does, doesn't she?" What he didn't say was that she also made the house feel warmer. Less like a place they were renting for the summer and more like a home. Later that day, while Ellie napped on the hammock outside, Daniel sat at his laptop trying to read through a proposal document for an acquisition his company was considering. But his mind kept drifting, not to the numbers, to the kitchen. The way Grace had moved around it like she belonged, the way Ellie had instantly softened in her presence. She had come in like a whisper, and already he wasn't sure what the house would feel like without her in it. The next morning came cooler than expected, with clouds stretched thin and gray across the lake. Daniel pulled on a hoodie before stepping out to grab the mail from the small box at the edge of the property. A heron stood knee-deep in the reeds just past the dock, still as a statue. For a long moment, Daniel just watched it, coffee warming his hands, the quiet soaking in deeper than it ever could in the city. When he walked back up the gravel path, he heard the front door open. "You start mornings early," Grace called from the porch, a grocery bag looped over her forearm. "Do you drink anything besides coffee?" Daniel gave a wry smile. "Define drink." She lifted a second paper bag from the step and held it up. "Fresh peaches. Thought I'd make Ellie a smoothie." He took the bag from her and they went inside together without much else said. It struck him again how natural she seemed in his space, how she walked with a sort of quiet purpose, as if she wasn't just filling a need but stitching something invisible into the rhythm of their day. Ellie bounded down not long after, barefoot and awake in a way she never was at home. "You're back," she said to Grace, climbing into one of the counter stools. "Told you I would be." Grace handed her a slice of peach. "Want to help me peel these?" Ellie nodded enthusiastically, and Daniel stepped back, watching the two of them settle into the kind of moment he didn't realize they'd been missing. Grace handed her a paring knife with the easy trust of someone who believed kids were more capable than most adults let them be. Under her guidance, Ellie focused, tongue sticking out as she worked the peel slowly away. He turned toward the dining table with his laptop but never opened it. Instead, he listened. Grace didn't talk much, only when necessary, and even then her tone stayed level, undemanding. Ellie filled the space without prompting, telling her about the chipmunk she'd seen in the yard, how she thought she might name it Pancake. "You always name things after food?" Grace asked, a corner of her mouth lifting. Ellie giggled. "Only when I'm hungry." Daniel watched the smile that passed between them, something quiet and understood. Then he opened his laptop just to give himself something to look at other than the flutter in his chest. They ate peach pancakes on the back deck that morning. Grace made them thin, almost crepe-like, with a brown sugar glaze that tasted like something from a bakery window. Daniel sat beside Ellie, who kept reaching over to steal bites from his plate. Grace didn't sit. She leaned against the railing, sipping tea, the morning breeze tugging at the edges of her sweater. She looked peaceful, not absent, not deferential, just self-contained. He noticed it in her hands, too. Clean nails, rough fingers, the kind that told stories without needing words. "You always lived around here?" Daniel asked once Ellie skipped down to the dock to watch the heron again. Grace nodded slowly. "Grew up on the other side of the lake. My mom still lives there." "What brought you back?" "I never left." He blinked. "You've never wanted to." She shrugged. "I like it here." Something about that answer made his chest tighten. He didn't understand it, not fully, but there was something honest in it. No performance, no apology. After breakfast, Grace washed the dishes and left with a nod and a low promise to return by lunchtime. When the screen door clapped shut behind her, Daniel glanced out the window and watched her walk down the gravel drive to her truck. She didn't rush, didn't check her phone, didn't move like the world was on fire the way he always did. Later that day, it rained. A slow, steady summer rain that started after lunch and didn't let up through the afternoon. Ellie wanted to bake cookies, so Daniel tried. They ended up with flour on their faces and a lumpy, barely edible batch of dough balls, but Ellie declared them pretty good, which was enough for him. As they curled up on the couch with books and blankets, Grace returned in the late afternoon, soaked through from a run to the truck and hair clinging to her neck. "Dinner might be a little improvised," she said, wringing out the hem of her sweater. "The farmer's market stand I usually buy from closed early." Daniel offered her a towel. She accepted it with a thank you so quiet he nearly missed it. While she cooked rosemary roasted chicken, potatoes, and a salad with warm balsamic, Ellie played with puzzles on the rug nearby, and Daniel found himself doing something foreign. He sat still, just watched, not just Grace but the whole picture. The way the rain tapped against the window panes, the way his daughter hummed to herself without a single complaint about being stuck inside, the way Grace layered flavors without a cookbook like memory lived in her hands. After Ellie went to bed, tucked in with a story about Pancake the Chipmunk and a sleepy yawn, Daniel wandered back into the kitchen. Grace was drying her hands on a towel, the dishes already done. "You're fast," he said, leaning against the doorway. "I'm practiced." He didn't ask what that meant. Instead, he walked in, leaned back against the counter beside her. "I've been meaning to say thank you," he said, "for how easy you've made all this. I didn't realize how out of my depth I'd be." Grace folded the towel neatly. "You're doing fine." He looked at her. "You mean that?" Her eyes met his. "I do. You love your daughter. She knows it. That's more than a lot of kids get." A pause stretched between them, something warm, heavy. "You don't have to stay late," he said finally, gently. "I don't mind. Still, you're not on call. I don't want to take advantage." "You're not," her voice dropped a little. "It's been a long time since I've liked being in someone else's kitchen." He didn't ask why, didn't press, but the way she said it stayed with him. As she reached for her bag, he moved toward the door to walk her out. Rain still misted the porch, but it had lightened to a whisper now. "I'll see you in the morning," she said, hand on the doorknob. "Grace," he said, stopping her. She looked up. "I hope this hasn't been strange for you, this whole arrangement. You're more than just a cook. You've changed the way this house feels. I noticed that." She looked at him a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Good night, Daniel." When she left, he stood on the porch a while longer, letting the cool mist cling to his skin, unsure of what had just shifted but knowing, somehow, that it had. The fourth week brought a rhythm that neither Daniel nor Grace spoke of but both obeyed. She arrived just before breakfast and left after dinner, and in between, her presence wove itself into the seams of the day, never forced, never lingering too long, yet always felt. There was no contract between them, no formal agreement, just a quiet understanding that for now she belonged there. Grace didn't ask questions about Daniel's company or why he spent an hour every morning in his study, even in this supposed time off. She didn't pry about Ellie's mother, or what had pulled the CEO of a tech firm from his glass-walled office and deposited him into a lakeside house with nothing but time and a daughter he was still learning to read. And Daniel didn't ask about the small scar that curved along her wrist when her sleeve slipped down, or about the way she sometimes stared out the window during dinner like she was listening for something no one else could hear. It was mid-July when the first shift came. They were on the back deck after dinner. Ellie had fallen asleep early, curled sideways on the porch swing with a paperback still open on her chest. The stars hadn't come out yet, but the sky was softening, the air smelling like pine and warm wood. Daniel poured 2 glasses of wine. He hadn't planned to, but there was something about the evening, the hush of it, that asked for company. Grace sat on the top step, knees bent, hands around her ankles. When he handed her the glass, she took it with a small smile. Their fingers brushed and something passed between them, barely there, but real. "You ever miss it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. "Miss what?" "The city, the noise, the rush, the part of you that used to run toward it." He exhaled, slow. "I used to think I was running toward something. Turns out I might have just been running away from everything else." She didn't respond right away, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. "I thought the same thing once," she said after a moment. "Different kind of running, but the same idea." Daniel glanced at her sideways. "Want to tell me about it?" Grace tipped her head back, watching the clouds pull apart. "I used to teach," she said finally. "Elementary school, 4th grade." The admission was simple, but her voice held a shadow. "I had this student, Clara, tiny girl curious about everything. Her home life was rough and I knew it, but she showed up every day with these questions about stars and oceans and poems. She was hungry to understand the world." Daniel didn't interrupt. "One day she stopped coming, just like that. I found out later her mom had taken her out of state, something with custody. I never got to say goodbye." Grace's fingers twisted around the stem of her wine glass. "I kept thinking if I'd done more, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe she wouldn't have slipped through the cracks." "You left after that?" She nodded. "Didn't make sense to stay. The classroom felt hollow." Daniel looked out toward the lake. The water held the last orange of sunset like a secret. "She was lucky to have had you," he said. "I don't know, I just hope someone else picked up where I couldn't." The wind shifted then, soft but cold enough to make her shiver slightly. Daniel moved inside for a blanket and returned without thinking, draping it over her shoulders. She didn't look up right away, but her hand reached for his briefly, an unspoken thank you passing through her touch. Later, after Grace left and the house was quiet again, Daniel sat at the edge of Ellie's bed and watched her breathe. Her cheeks were flushed from sleep, one arm tossed over her head like she was dreaming big things. He smoothed a hand down her curls and felt something settle in him, a kind of clarity, a slow realization that summer had undone something in him, loosened a knot he'd been too proud or too numb to name. In the days that followed, he started closing his laptop earlier. Sometimes he didn't open it at all. Instead, he sat at the kitchen island and watched Grace cook, learning her rhythms. He offered to chop vegetables even when he did it wrong. She corrected him with a smirk and no judgment. One afternoon, they took Ellie berry picking. Grace knew a hidden patch down a side road, tucked behind a fallen gate and a narrow trail. Ellie's hand stained purple within minutes, her basket more leaves than berries. But she laughed and Grace laughed with her, and Daniel found himself staring. Not just because she was beautiful in the sun, though she was. It was the way she looked at Ellie, without hesitation, without the wary carefulness that often came from adults who weren't sure how to be around children. Grace didn't force joy, didn't pretend affection. She simply allowed space for it to grow. That night, as Grace folded a blueberry tart into the oven and Ellie painted rocks on the deck, Daniel found himself leaning against the fridge, arms crossed. "Why did you say yes?" he asked quietly. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "To what?" "This job, us." Grace tilted her head, thoughtful. "You asked honestly, that's rare. Most people want to buy their way into a solution. You sounded like someone who'd tried everything else first." Daniel laughed under his breath. "I did." She leaned back against the counter, mirroring his stance. "I figured I'd cook for you both a few times, maybe give you a better summer. I didn't expect." She stopped herself. "What?" She shook her head gently, "to care this much." They didn't touch, didn't move closer, but the air between them changed. The tart came out golden and soft in the middle. They ate it warm, all three of them on the couch with one big plate balanced between them, taking turns with spoons and laughing when Ellie tried to hoard the crust edges. When Grace stood to leave, Daniel walked her out again. At the door, they stood facing each other in the quiet. "Good night," she said, almost too softly. He didn't say it back right away. Instead, his hand rose to her arm, bare, warm, freckled from the sun. He rested his fingers just above her wrist, not pulling, not asking. "You don't have to go," he said, the words almost a whisper. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I do," she replied, "for now." She left him with that, not rejection, not distance, just a boundary drawn with care. And still, when she walked down the steps and disappeared into the dark, Daniel stayed at the door, heart steady but stretched, knowing something irreversible had begun to shift between them. The summer began to tip toward August. The lake warmed at the surface, holding heat like a secret, and the mornings lost their chill. The air turned heavier, the kind that carried the scent of pine and damp earth and sun-baked dockwood. Daniel noticed the change in Ellie first. She started waking up before the sun did, asking questions about the stars, about when school would start again, about whether Grace would come with them when they left. He never had a good answer. He told her the truth, gently, that they'd go back to the city when the leaves started turning and that Grace had her own life here. But the answers didn't sit right in his own mouth, not anymore. Grace, for her part, remained constant. She came with peaches and corn and basil in her bags, cooked like the world could be held together with butter and thyme, and never asked for more than what the day gave her. But Daniel could feel something growing beneath the surface, a stillness between them that trembled now and then like a tightrope in wind. One night they built a fire down by the water. Grace brought marshmallows and a small folding chair. Ellie carried a flashlight and 3-gram crackers crushed in her pocket. Daniel brought blankets, not because it was cold, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. They roasted until the marshmallows caught fire, and Ellie shrieked with laughter, her face sticky and full of wonder. When she got sleepy, she curled up with a blanket near the fire pit, her head in Daniel's lap. Grace sat across from them, one leg pulled under her, eyes reflecting the flicker of flames. "She's not like other kids I've met," Grace said softly. Daniel brushed a curl from Ellie's forehead. "How do you mean?" "She pays attention, like she's always watching the adults around her, trying to figure out if it's safe to be a kid." Daniel looked at Grace, then at his daughter. "She had to grow up faster than she should have. I was there, but not really, not in the way she needed." "You're trying now," Grace said. "She knows it." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes I worry I'm late." "Maybe, but you showed up. That counts for something." The logs shifted in the fire, popping softly. Daniel glanced at her again, the shadows of flame moving across her face. Her features were gentle in the dark, less guarded. He wondered if she realized how many of her own walls had fallen over the past few weeks, or how clearly he could see her now. "She asks about you," he said. "Ellie." Grace tilted her head. "She wants to know what you'll do when we go back." Grace didn't respond for a while. Then, "What do you want me to do?" Daniel didn't expect the question. He'd spent his career in rooms where people carefully chose every word. Grace never did. She just asked what she meant to ask, and now it sat between them, raw and full of implication. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm trying to figure that out without being selfish." She smiled, tired but kind. "You're allowed to want things." "I want this house to feel the way it feels now," he said, "even when we're gone." Her gaze dropped to the fire. "That's the trick, isn't it? How to take something with you that wasn't built to travel." He didn't ask her what she wanted, he already knew. She belonged to the lake, the air, the rhythm of things growing and fading in their time. She didn't want to be swept into his world of elevators and quarterly projections and dinners scheduled 2 months in advance. And yet she'd stepped into his life anyway, not just to feed it, but to fill it. The next day, Grace didn't come. No call, no text, just absence. At first, Daniel thought maybe something had come up. He told Ellie Grace was probably just delayed, and they made cereal and toast without complaint. But by lunch, when she still hadn't arrived, he started to feel it, an unease that had nothing to do with scheduling. He didn't want to call, didn't want to invade her space. So instead, he packed sandwiches and took Ellie out on the old rowboat that had come with the house. They floated across the lake, casting small rocks into the shallows and trying to name the shapes in the clouds. Did Grace stop liking us? Ellie asked at one point quiet. Daniel's stomach turned. No, sweetheart, people sometimes just need space. She didn't say goodbye. I know. That night when the sun dropped and Grace still hadn't come, Daniel walked to the far side of the lake. A path led through the trees, unmarked but well-worn, curving along the shore. He didn't know if he expected to find her, but something in him needed the walk. When he arrived at the small cabin tucked behind the birch trees, he paused. The porch light was off. The windows dark, but her truck was there. He stood at the bottom step, unsure, then knocked once. The door opened slowly. Grace stood barefoot in a long cardigan, hair unpinned and damp like she'd just stepped out of a shower. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak. "I needed a day." He nodded, heart beating too fast. "You didn't owe us an explanation, but I missed you." She looked down. "I wasn't sure I should come back." "Why?" Grace opened the door wider but didn't step aside. "Because it's getting harder not to want what I can't have." He stepped in then, not into the cabin but into the space between them. Close enough to see the tired around her eyes, the vulnerability she'd never quite shown. "I didn't ask you to follow us," he said. "I don't want to take you from this place, but I do want to be honest." She looked up, barely breathing. "I think about you, not just in the kitchen or on the porch, but when Ellie laughs, I think about how you helped her find her joy again. When I wake up, I listen for your voice. I miss you before you're even gone." Her eyes filled just slightly, but she didn't look away. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was necessary. It held all the unspoken things, his loneliness, her grief, the weight of two lives running parallel but not quite intersecting. "I can't promise anything yet," she said. "Not forever." "I'm not asking for forever," he replied. "Just more of this, whatever this is." She closed the distance then. Her forehead rested against his chest, her breath a quiet tremble, and he held her, without demand, without urgency. Just a man who'd spent too many years pretending he didn't need anyone, finally admitting that he did. When they returned to the house together the next morning, Ellie ran into Grace's arms like nothing had ever broken. And maybe, Daniel thought, as he watched the two of them spin barefoot on the grass, arms wide to the morning sun, maybe nothing had. Maybe it had only just begun to bloom. August waned like the last notes of a long song, and Lake Alder took on the amber light of approaching change. The days were still warm, but shadows came earlier now, stretching longer across the lawn in the late afternoons. Cicadas sang louder than they had in July, a kind of farewell in their restless buzz. Inside the house, the rhythm continued. Grace at the stove, Ellie asking questions no adult could answer. Daniel watching the two of them like a man who had once been starving and only now realized what nourishment felt like. But there was a difference now, not in routine but in presence. Grace stayed longer after Ellie fell asleep. They didn't name it, didn't call it love, but she would linger on the porch with him, a second glass of wine between them, her feet tucked beneath her in the porch swing while he listened to the quiet around them. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes Daniel just watched her out of the corner of his eye as she traced the lip of her glass or closed her eyes to the sound of crickets. Once he reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch. She turned toward him with a look that held all the things they still hadn't said. "I've started dreaming again," she told him one night, voice soft. He didn't answer right away, just waited. "Of Clara, the girl I taught. I see her sometimes, older, happy. I think I stopped allowing myself to believe she could be okay after she left." "And now?" he asked. Grace looked toward the lake, silver in the moonlight. "Now I think I can believe in good endings again." Daniel reached for her hand, let his fingers settle over hers with the ease of a man who knew he could no longer pretend she hadn't changed him. "You gave Ellie that and me." She looked at him then, eyes full of warmth and gravity. "You gave it to yourself." He wanted to kiss her then, not because it was owed or overdue, but because there was nothing else in the world that felt more right, and she let him. With a quiet, breathless yes in the way she leaned in, the way her hands found his face like she'd been waiting too. It wasn't fireworks, it wasn't the crashing romance of late-night movies. It was stillness, it was breath, It was the feeling of coming home after being gone too long. But summer always ends. And it did. The week before they were scheduled to return to the city, the house filled with cardboard boxes and the sound of drawers being opened and closed. Ellie dragged her feet more. She clung to Grace in the mornings, trying to memorize the scent of her, the sound of her humming while flipping pancakes. Daniel had avoided the subject for days, but finally, on a quiet afternoon while Ellie was out with a neighbor's kid, he found Grace standing on the dock, arms folded, wind lifting her hair off her shoulders. "Come with us," he said. She didn't turn around. "Daniel. No pressure, no conditions, just come for a week, for a month, as long as you want." She finally faced him. Her expression was steady, but something flickered in her eyes. "You know I can't." "Tell me why." "Because if I go, I won't come back," she said, voice breaking for the first time. "And I'm not ready to give this place up." Daniel stepped closer. "Then let me stay." She laughed once gently. "You have a company. It'll run without me." "You say that now." "I say it because I've finally started seeing clearly. I built something huge, and in the process, I lost the small things that mattered more." He reached for her hand, the same way he had on the porch that night. "I'm not asking you to leave the life you love. I'm asking if we can make space in it for the life we've started together." Grace went still. "Then what about Ellie?" "She wants you with us," he said, "but she also wants me to be who I've become this summer, and I think I can be, not in the same way, but better. I don't want to live in two separate lives anymore." They sat on the dock for a long time, side by side, legs dangling over the edge. The lake lapped gently below them, small waves folding into each other like they had nowhere else to be. "I need to stay," Grace said finally, quietly. Daniel nodded, his heart aching in a way that felt both heavy and honest. "But I want to visit," she added. "I want to come see what your world looks like when you've made room for joy." He looked at her then, really looked. "You mean that?" She turned, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I've never meant anything more." The morning they left, Grace helped pack the last of the groceries into the trunk. Ellie clung to her, eyes damp but not sobbing. When Grace knelt down to say goodbye, Ellie whispered something in her ear that made Grace laugh and tear up at once. "You'll come visit?" Ellie asked, wiping her nose. "I will," Grace said, "and you'll come back every summer." Daniel stood beside them, keys in hand, watching, aching, grateful. When they pulled away, Grace stood at the edge of the driveway, waving once. No grand gestures, no tears, just the steady presence of someone who'd kept her heart open, even when it was hard. Back in the city, the noise returned. The traffic, the meetings, the ever-buzzing phone. But Daniel changed. He cooked breakfast with Ellie every Saturday morning. He picked her up from school, even when it meant stepping out of the boardroom early. And every evening, when the house was finally quiet, he stepped onto the balcony with a glass of wine and his phone. He and Grace texted often. They called some nights, sent pictures, little things, a stack of pancakes, a letter Ellie wrote her, a sunset Grace captured from the dock. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And come June, when the school year ended and the city turned sticky and gray, Daniel didn't hesitate. He packed the car with Ellie's backpack, a stack of books, and a suitcase with nothing but shorts and linen shirts. They returned to the lake. And Grace was waiting on the porch. No fireworks, no rush. Just two people who'd built something slowly, quietly, deliberately. And finally they stepped into it together.